Welcome to this webinar of the RAI's Committee for Anthropology of Policy and Practice. This is a bit of housekeeping at the start to get you all oriented. And for those of you who don't know the Royal Anthropological Institute yet, we are a UK-based learned society promoting the understanding of anthropology. And we run weekly events online and also conferences, symposiums, and a film festival. If you would like to support us in going on with our events, please do consider becoming a fellow. I'm going to put a link in the chat later, which leads you to more information on that. And just to let you know about our next big event that we're planning, going to quickly share a slide here with you all. There you go. In October, we are holding a major interdisciplinary conference on anthropology and conservation. A strong focus of this conference will be on Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous rights. And our main co-organizer is the University of East Anglia School of International Development. And we are also pleased to have alongside them the University of Kent School of Anthropology and Conservation, Forest Peoples Programme, the Linnean Society, Royal Botanic Gardens Kew, the Anthropology and Environment Society, which is a subsection of the AAA, Botanic Garden Conservation International, and the Society of Ethnobiology. I'm going to hand over to the chair, Richard Axelby, now. Thank you.
Thanks, Haneen, and hi, everyone. Welcome to the latest in this series of Anthropology Communicates webinars, hosted by the RAI and organised by the RAI Anthropology of Policy and Practice Committee. The Policy and Practice Committee was established as a platform to improve links between anthropologists, policymakers and practitioners. Members of the committee straddle academia and applied work. Some work in universities, but also others work in the health sector, in development and humanitarian aid, in the civil service, in the corporate sector, and in civil society organisations, including charities. What unites us is either being anthropologists or being passionate about anthropology and its ability to contribute to both understanding and improving the world in which we all live. Which brings us to these Anthropology Communicate seminars, which we see as an opportunity to spread understanding of anthropology and highlight its unique perspectives, and therefore to increase influence of the discipline. But at the same time, to also an opportunity to encourage anthropologists to engage with different audiences in different settings and different contexts, and by doing so to bring about positive social impact. So in short, these seminars we use as an opportunity to highlight how, what, where, when, and with whom anthropology communicates, which brings me to the latest in this series, which we've titled Anthropology Communicates with Civil Society. So it's a chance to explore how anthropologists can effectively work with civil society organisations, including charities, co-designing research and interventions in ways that are mutually beneficial, communicating the findings and the results in ways that resonate and inspire. And we have three speakers today. I'm really pleased they were able to join us. We have in reverse order, we have Alex Clegg, Senior Community Coordinator at Sense About Science, which is an independent charity that champions the public interest in sound science and ensures evidence is recognised in public life and policy making. Alex is also a member of the Anthropology and Policy Practice Committee at the RAI. We have Ingrid Abreu Scherer, the civil society lead at What Works Wellbeing, the UK's national body for wellbeing evidence and practice. So Ingrid works with charities, with social enterprises, and those who support them to develop effective programmes and build the evidence on what really works. And our third speaker today is Danny Miller, who I'm sure you all know is Professor of Anthropology at UCL, editor or author of over 39 books, including Tales from Facebook, Digital Anthropology, and Social Media in an English Village. He's also a long-standing champion of ethnography and engagement. The format for today, we're going to have Danny speaking first, then Ingrid, and then Alex, about 10-15 minutes each. And then we'll have an hour, which we'll be able to open up and widen out these conversations, inviting questions from the audience, but also comments and thoughts and ideas. So it's not a conventional question and answer session. It's more a chance for you to join an ongoing conversation. So with that, without further ado, I will hand over to Danny.
Well, thank you very much indeed. And I'm delighted to be part of what sounds like a really interesting webinar. I'm going to start with issues of public dissemination and then move on to the relationship, particularly with, if you like, civil society. Now, charities, anthropology, at one level, we all kind of feel we want to do some good in the world. And with charities, I think it's relatively straightforward. They have a specific purpose, they're designated, and they kind of get on with it. Situation with anthropology, I'm going to suggest, is actually quite strange, because when we start, we're taught, oh, well, anthropology is a discipline and its primary purpose is to help people, wherever they may be, to have a more empathetic, sensitive engagement with other peoples that are very different from themselves, or some such, right? But when you actually today want to talk about the ethical dimensions and the good that anthropology might do, I find that almost every discussion ends up being about a field worker and their informants. It's like consent forms, etc. To actually discuss why we are doing this in terms of the larger good seems to have almost, I would argue, disappeared. Forgive me if I've overgeneralized. Now, that's the area that I've tended to try and concentrate on over the two projects I've been involved in the last 7 years. And we've done it by essentially not compromising, I think, on the form of what we produce as anthropologists, because mainly it's the production of ethnographic monographs, but trying to make them available to much bigger audiences, because typically the ethnographic monograph is going to, if you're lucky, 600 people. In the series of 11 books we did for the Why We Post, we're currently well over 1 million downloads, and it's very, very international. So almost any country in the world, you will find these books. And that has been through concentrating on accessibility. It includes, obviously, firstly, going open access, so that everything we do is free. I think actually, if anything, more important is the accessibility of the English, that we write only in colloquial English. Discussion with and about academics is in footnotes and endnotes, so there is a narrative about the ethnography that is much more easily available. And then, of course, we use social media and other ways of trying to make these things very accessible. In the next series, which actually is launching on May the 6th, with books like The Global Smartphone, we've again tried to think how we can work further in this direction. So all the new books, for example, contain very short videos of the length that we think people will look at. We also, after the recent success of the Illustrating Anthropology program that was done by the RAI, we're putting a lot of cartoons out on the website, etc., etc. And this seems to be the first task. It'd be nice to be engaged with civil society, but first, it'd be nice to be engaged with society. So, trying to get things across. But then I think if you go then beyond that and beyond this sort of educative function of anthropology and say, okay, we also want, alongside charities and others, to sometimes be engaged more directly in terms of improving people's welfare and maybe a more practical venture, etc. And again, I find kind of issues within the discipline of anthropology itself, because it's, again, very generalized, but my sense of being in anthropology for decades is that we have a rather strange kind of idea of the status of anthropologists, in which, by and large, the people at the sort of top of that are essentially engaged in what they see as pure critique. If that's what you do, and you basically tell why everything is kind of wrong in the world, the point is pure critique is sort of unsullied. It is pure. And against that, what used once to be called applied anthropology now tends to be called engaged anthropology, tended to be seen, I think, as kind of inevitably compromised. That you then had to work with governments, you had to work with charity, work with corporations, NGOs, etc., and it never could be quite this kind of unsullied form of critique. And I think that is always been a bit of a problem, actually, from our side. And I'm sure you're familiar with, the critique of development and so forth. However, I don't just want to be another critique. I think actually we also have considerable problems when we do try, and notwithstanding all that, engage. And also I should say there are sections like medical anthropology where I don't think what I've just said is probably true. So let me just give a concrete example. In our recent project, I think we have one in particular really important finding. And we've been working on the use of smartphones for health. And we started with a consideration of what's a huge industry today, which is known as the M-Health industry. And it's vast amounts of the production of specialist health apps for smartphones. And if you look at the 10 ethnographies we've just carried out, we argue overall that we think most of these are going to have very limited impacts, except in specialist kind of areas. That overall, what turns out to be far more valuable, I think, in terms of how most people relate to health issues using their smartphones, is actually not the proliferation of specialist apps, but the way just about everybody has been creative in finding ways of adapting the apps that they are comfortable with, that they are familiar with, for purposes of health. So first we kind of observed that, but we wanted to go beyond that. And one of the projects in particular concentrated on all the different ways you could already observe people in different areas of the health sector using WhatsApp. And having observed that, then it changes the relationship between anthropology and policy, that we become what we call we're doing what we call smart from below. It's recognizing the ingenuity of people and bringing it to policy so that people can learn from those practices. So our idea is then we observe these things, we collate them, and we then went a stage further. We created a manual, I think very nicely illustrated. It's 150 pages, it's on our website, of how you can use WhatsApp specifically for the purposes of health and in medical areas. How much usage has been made of this? As of yet, pretty much I would say nothing. And the general point that I think follows from that is, even though we think this has huge possibilities, it saves vast amounts of money. You don't actually have to create the thing. It's already embedded in everyday life. So the pilot project is vast, and you can see all the issues and complexities there. For us, it's like obviously something that could be of benefit. But the problem is when you then come as anthropologists with something to offer to another body, in practice, those bodies have their own agendas. People have a job in which they're paid to get on with something, and mainly in this case, producing themselves, and this doesn't necessarily assist in that, because what we're doing costs nothing, and actually, and isn't going to make any money, and it just doesn't fit. So we find it very difficult to come out of the anthropology with the finding and then find and persuade people actually to make use of it. Similar, actually, I would say, decades of experience in trying to work with journalism, that, if you come with a story, it is incredibly hard to get anybody to take it up. If they come to you with a story and want you to comment on that, that's no problem. And that kind of works. And that's essentially been also my experience. Now, to take a few years ago, I was approached by the clinical director of UK hospices to do work on the potential of media in the hospice movement. And so I worked under their auspices, produced this book, The Comfort of People, etc. Even that, I must admit, wasn't used quite as much as I would have liked, but nevertheless, it works because you are, in a sense, doing something as commissioned by the wider body, and you're fitting in as an anthropologist in that way. And I think that you know, there are then possibilities. I mean, you can, if you have the funding to then utilize what you have suggested, that's a way you can actually move forward. But I mean, I'll finish in a sense with a success story, if you like. In the current project, one of the team, Charlotte Hawkins, has been working in Uganda, and Charlotte's great. I mean, she shares a lot of the critiques in terms of, she's very clear that she wanted interventions that were sustainable. Not just during the period of aid, that she wanted to work with Ugandan doctors directly, etc. And she had a particular interest. Out of her ethnography came a lot of concerns about mental health, and also people who are caring for others with mental health issues. So she wanted to develop a telepsychiatry system around phones. And actually, she's been very successful. I think they've raised maybe, £200,000 or £300,000 actually now, and she's currently in Kampala helping to develop this. But I think one of the reasons she did succeed goes back to what I was saying before. The papers that she was writing alongside the Ugandan doctors to actually promote this look nothing like anthropology. It's all, data and models and quantitative, etc., etc. I mean, she was absolutely prepared to make the compromise to effectively translate into another language, a language I can't speak. And within that, they were able to work together and get engaged. So my problem, as it were, to finish is this, that I think that I can only talk from my own experience. That's all I've had so far. But I've tended to find there are certain conditions in which this dialogue has been possible. And like Charlotte, she's been able to work with bodies. But as in my mHealth project, there are others where, even though I think we have a lot to offer, I don't know how to do this. I can't find a way of getting engaged in terms of our dialogue, or the way we have tried to construct it coming out of the ethnographic inquiry, even when we've tried to make it as accessible and usable as possible. And that's why, in a sense, I'm very pleased to be here, because that's my experience, and I think it is very limited. But what I want to know is, how have other people managed to do this? What are the lessons that one could learn? And how can we go forward in, as was said at the beginning, in this kind of productive dialogue with anthropology working together, hopefully within bodies with civil society. And that's my time, so thank you very much.
Thank you, Danny. Ingrid, I know you're going to use a PowerPoint, so do you want to set that up? Really interesting, Danny, and I think it sets up Ingrid's contribution very nicely. This contradiction within anthropology. On the one hand, this incredible social discipline that engages with people. As ethnographers, we engage with people, but if in a sense, as anthropologists, to use that sort of divide between ethnography and anthropology, we're quite antisocial. We don't seek out ways in which we can engage for wider impact. And I agree. I think that's partly because we're not even sure what's out there or what we can do. So, Ingrid, I think this was going to be your starting point for your contribution.
Thank you very much. I hope you weren't expecting me to have all the answers. I definitely think there's no silver bullet, but I've been thinking about this for a little while, and I've got some ideas. Richard, you're the only person I can see now, so you'll have to wave at me if you can't hear me anymore, or if I go over. So thank you very much for having me. It's really interesting for me to be in this forum. Anthropology is not something I know a lot about, so apologies if I come across as very ignorant. I'm used to work with other disciplines in social science and in humanities, so I will tell you a little bit about what I know and what I think about what anthropologists and charities can offer each other. So I'm from an organisation called the What Works Centre for Wellbeing. So we are an independent organisation that brings together robust, accessible and useful evidence about wellbeing. We work with a number of academic institutions. We have worked with up to 20 academic institutions at a time. We are funded by a mix of research council, lottery funding, and government funding. And we're part of this network called the What Works Network. Maybe some of you have heard of us. There are about 13 centres now. You will have heard of some of them. So, for example, NICE, the National Institute for Clinical Excellence, is a What Works Centre, Centre for Ageing Better, Education Endowment Foundation. We're all What Works centres. And although we're very different, are very different sizes, have very different audiences and topics, we all do the same thing, which is we all need to say something useful and robust about effectiveness and cost effectiveness of interventions. So we are very much focused on what works in terms of interventions across all kinds of different sectors and policy areas. And, you know, if something works, is it worth it for the public purse usually, or for other types of funders? So it's a very specific type of research. And it means that we don't do a lot of primary research. Some of the other centres fund trials. We don't, but all of the centres do systematic evidence reviews. So we look at thousands and thousands and thousands of published papers, academic and grey literature, quant and qual, bring it all together and try to make an assessment. Overall, what does the evidence say about something? We also have a range of different audiences, government, central, local government, health, businesses, corporations and employers are a big audience for wellbeing research. And from my point of view, charities. So I'm civil society lead, so I work with charities, social enterprises, and a lot of charity trusts and foundations to help people spend money well and to help people generate evidence. So I'm also, in my spare time, the chair of trustees and a founding member of a small community charity in my neighbourhood in Walthamstow called The Mill. These are some of my neighbours who are also involved in the charity. So I kind of have a sense of what this looks like from the charity end as well, especially from the smaller charity end. So I know some of the stresses and challenges that charities have in using and generating evidence. But very briefly, the recent research at the centre covers all kinds of different things. It looks at effectiveness of activities, but also looks at effectiveness at community level. So community wellbeing is a slightly different version of wellbeing that we also look at. We do conceptual reviews, for example, recently one on loneliness. We look at understanding inequalities across population, and we look at methodology, for example, and cost effectiveness. So there's quite a lot of different work that we do. And we provide practical tools. So this is something I developed very recently. It's an online guide for charities on how to develop a wellbeing evaluation to see if their activities are having an impact on wellbeing. It had like 6,000 views in the first, unique views in the first month. So we know that there's an appetite for practical tools to help charities tell their story about wellbeing impacts, about impact in general. And we also kind of support that by training and advice of all types of different ways for charities and funders and policymakers. Some of the things we talk about in that training and those advice sessions are here, kind of very broad: how to use, how to find evidence, how to use evidence, how to generate evidence, how to think about evidence, how to interpret your findings, all kinds of things. This little picture in the corner is what we imagine charities look like. There's usually just maybe one or two people in a charity whose job it is to both design, run the program and understand the impact. And so we know people are very busy and very stretched. So we try to keep that in mind when we're translating the evidence for them to use. So I've put this on here because this is what I imagine anthropologists look like. This is how you know that I don't know any anthropologists, but I'm sure you'll prove me wrong. I wanted to just very quickly, from a layperson's point of view, say what I think anthropologists have that charities need. And the first thing is knowledge. Knowledge about why people feel, act, and relate the way they do to each other. Knowledge about how people respond to different situations and why they respond in that way, and how you can use that knowledge to, communicate with them when there's a public health message or something else where you want people to react in a certain way. You need to understand what has happened before, what has happened in other contexts. I think anthropologists have knowledge about what affects community cohesion and community networks, although these might not be necessarily terminology that's used perhaps in anthropology. And also anthropologists look at a unit of analysis that charities are very interested in, but where they don't necessarily get evidence from other disciplines. So whereas psychologists or economists or all kinds of other scientists can give you a lot of information about individuals, far fewer social scientists are giving information about families or communities as the unit of analysis. And I think that's something where anthropologists can come in. And also thinking about communities quite broadly as communities of place or communities of interest or of identity, which are three of the main communities that charities have. The other thing that I think anthropologists have is knowledge about some things that charities care about. Charities care very, very much about how they can be more effective. And in particular, what are the key ingredients that can make their activities effective? Is there anything they can tweak? Any small improvements they can make? Are there any kind of gold nuggets across their program of activities that they should particularly nurture? And also, charities care about how activities leads to outcomes. This is how their funding is doled out. And this is also how they organize their programs generally. So they need to have some sort of logical explanation for why their activities produce certain outcomes. And some of those explanations are about mechanisms of change. And I think anthropologists have a lot of knowledge about these mechanisms. And I'll say a little bit about that in a second. But there is a tendency, I think, to think that charities don't have time or energy to think about big topics. And I think that's not necessarily true. When you look at the civil society sector, especially in the last year, huge amounts of effort and thought have gone into really big questions. How do we make society more equal and inclusive? How do we understand concepts of belonging and identity, of fairness and safety? Who is our society for? Who is our society fair or safe for, and therefore who is missing out? How can we think meaningfully about participation and representation in a slightly new way? And if you're familiar with the language of social capital, how can our understanding of the bonds, of the bridges and the links in society help us create a fairer conditions, especially for people who are missing out? So charities across the country are working on this and are thinking really big thoughts about it. Similarly, there's a lot of interest in resilience, particularly community resilience. We get a lot of questions asking us, how can we prepare our communities for future shocks? How can we use our understanding of altruism or volunteering, of public giving? Public giving has been huge this year, and it has made charities and across civil society really think, how do we harness that huge outpouring of goodwill and of action that we saw a year ago and not allow it to kind of fizzle away in the way it sort of has already? Or is the fizzling away normal? And actually, should we be propping something else up in society to create resilience? So all of these things, I think, anthropologists have knowledge about that charities want. Theories of change. So charities, not all of them, and definitely not the very small ones, but charities increasingly are thinking and are being asked by funders and commissioners to think about how their activities lead to outcomes and impacts. And one of the common ways to do this is through a theory of change, which is just a description of the logical leaps by which an activity leads to your outcome. This is the Trees for City theory of change. It's very big, lots of different moving parts, lots of interconnections leading to, small activities leading to big impacts through intermediary mechanisms and outcomes. This is one for the Youth Impact Fund, Youth Investment Fund, which is a slightly simpler one, but actually the main components are there. You have your activities, your mechanisms of change, which are the bits that are kind of almost the least understood, the least evidenced. And then you have outcomes. Did something work? Impacts. Has that outcome lasted? This is another theory of change that we developed. So I did this one on the back of a rapid evidence assessment on volunteering and well-being. And it shows you very, very simply how we think volunteers are able to achieve well-being impacts through their volunteering. It's through this process of getting, purpose, the sense of purpose and embedded values and identity, better connections and relationships, and personal growth. So these are the kind of areas where I think anthropologists can add evidence that charities need. Anthropologists also have skills. This is my second point. They have skills in how to research social behaviours, attitudes and motivations. So how to understand societies and how to understand behaviours between groups. They have a critical and questioning attitude. I'm not sure that's very controversial. The anthropologists I have met in the past have always been very difficult in a very positive way. And I think sometimes charities get stuck thinking, oh, we've always done things this way, so we'll just carry on. If it's not broke, don't fix it. So I think a critical and questioning attitude is actually really useful. And anthropologists know how to conduct research in a complex setting, which charities often find hard to kind of get their heads around if they're doing evaluations or trying to do some community research. Anthropologists obviously have a lot of experience in interpreting results and in ethical considerations around social research. So I think these are all skills that charities could really use in some way, either through collaboration or through training. And so what do charities have that anthropologists might need? So firstly, they are connected and experienced. They have a trusted and credible place for the most part. I'm now talking about small charities, not big international charities who might be perhaps a bit less trusted these days. But for the most part, community charities have a really trusted place in society. And they can be a really helpful intermediary to linking with groups who you might want to work with and study with. They're very obviously linked in with groups with lived experience, and they have experience and historical knowledge of how things have changed for that group of people in that place. So they can probably cut a lot of corners in the sense that they are kind of a repository of historical knowledge and understanding of a complex context. This is an example of a peer research piece of work that the Young Women's Trust has conducted. They do a lot of peer research at the moment and have trained peer researchers who are really effective in getting some of the information that other young women might not share with scientists or strangers. Charities are also interested and passionate. They are very committed to their cause and very thoughtful and curious about their communities. Although they're always looking for ways to be effective, they also are always looking for ways to raise the voice of their beneficiaries and to give people a way of expressing their experience in very personal ways. Charities also know exactly which questions need answering. Sometimes the disconnect between science and practice comes at the developing of questions. So I think that's a very valuable role that charities can play, and they can really help with interpreting findings. So quite often when we work with social researchers and they say, oh, we're not really sure why this finding is happening. And you go back to the group of people who you know is practicing in this field, and they say, oh, it's because of this thing that happened 5 years ago that nobody's forgotten about. So they're really experts in interpretation as well. But there are some potential barriers, as Danny was saying. The ones that I think are fairly obvious are that there is this issue of jargon and technical language. That's in both directions. So if you've heard me talk about outcomes and impact and theory of change, and if that doesn't mean anything to you, that's because charities use that language as well. So there's some kind of mutual translation that needs to happen. I think a slightly bigger barrier is that charities work on perhaps different timescales and priorities, especially than academic researchers. Very quick funding opportunities mean that they need questions answered, or where their evaluation covers a very small period of time, that also affects how much they're able to develop or access research. And maybe, and I put a little question mark on here, maybe there's a disagreement, or just a fundamental disagreement on the importance of outcomes. I don't know. This is slightly, I think, made me think about what Danny was saying, which is there something about applied or engaged anthropology versus critiques? Is outcomes kind of a bit of a dirty word in some fields? I do think there are some huge potentials for opportunities, especially right now. Everybody's trying to use evidence to be really effective and efficient in recovering from the pandemic. And I think there's something, I think anthropologists have knowledge about how societies have dealt with crisis and emergencies in the past or in other areas, which I think could help here. And I think both charities and anthropologists could help each other make sense of big social change and inequalities that is kind of coming to the fore of our discourse at the moment. And I think there's a kind of an enduring opportunity to help each other understand which mechanisms and key ingredients are really important for civil society to make a difference. And that's it.
Thank you, Ingrid. There was a lot that resonated there, especially with earlier webinars we've held in this series. Alex, do you want to start putting your PowerPoint up? Yeah, an awful lot that resonated, Ingrid, both in terms of, you know, anthropology's ability to answer questions, and you talked about, you know, the sort of the social relationships and feelings and connections people have, and anthropology's ability to sort of to get answers and provide answers. Often we're called upon to provide information about hard to reach communities or marginalised groups, and I'm thinking as well that not only is there the possibility to provide answers, but there's also the possibility to question questions, if you like, which in a way I think is even more important, because it involves speaking up to power. When you mentioned effectiveness, and especially cost effectiveness, you know, how do we think about value? How do we think about outputs and results? How do we think about theories of change? You know, when change isn't always linear, it is always a series of steps. You know, change may not be tangible. So anthropology's ability to communicate the intangible, the unpredictable, I think and all think about different types of evidence and what's acceptable, and to communicate between different types of policymakers and different types of stakeholders about feelings, reactions, outputs, evidence, values, and so on. Alex, are you about ready? Great. Okay, we'll hand over to Alex then.
Thank you. I had a warning about my internet was unstable, so a last-minute room change closer to the Wi-Fi. Okay, smashing. So I'm coming at this, you know, wearing several different hats. So someone who's volunteered and worked at charities. Someone who sense about science of public engagement professionals, so working with you know, mainly the natural sciences, but increasingly the social sciences. But then also, I suppose, an anthropologist who's very early in their career, you know, studying an MA, but really keen to see, you know, I want to, you know, contribute to society's big challenges. You know, as Danny mentioned before, you know, it's something which I think, you know, why I want to study the discipline. So the pandemic, you know, it's not only highlighted, you know, how civil society organisations, charities have stepped in and stepped up, you know, in supporting people and communities in the UK and across the world, but it's also highlighted for all of expert insider advice. So, you know, you can see this increasingly in the social sciences and in anthropology. So, you know, we might be able to offer explanations for, you know, irrational cultural behaviour, such as the moral panic over panic buying of toilet paper, or, you know, where it's maybe had a bit more of a impact, you know, encouraging, you know, public health messaging. So, for example, not shaming people about not washing hands. But also, I think increasingly, there's a role for anthropology to play more than this sort of just understanding, you know, different cultures, but also be able to, you know, turn attention to the structures of in our society and how organisations have worked and maybe not worked effectively during the pandemic. And so in this, you know, in this short 10 minutes, 15 minutes, I want to, you know, cover 3 areas really. And first of all, I want to cover some assumptions which I think are often made about anthropology and by anthropologists looking to do engagement, and sort of question a few of them. I'm going to turn to look at some practical tips, which for both anthropologists and civil society organisations, which have come up, not only general tips from public engagement, but have come up in conversations I've been having with anthropologists in preparation for this. And finally, I just want to finish with a few questions, to get the conversation going, really. So first of all, not every intervention needs to have a really strong evidence base about it, and not every anthropologist needs to engage as well. I think, obviously there's a lot of people here, and that's you're obviously interested in this, but I don't think it's necessary. And when we're talking about this as a discipline and reaching out, I think it's quite important to encourage people that it's okay not to be engaged as well. I think it's an important starting point. Second, and this has been instilled in me, the first time I began to hear of anthropology, is that it's a dangerous discipline. It's got links to colonialism, it's got links to imperialism, and it's been used to harm people and cultures. And there is truth in this, but if that's an excuse to not engage in complex discussions, then it just leaves others to pick up the debate, and the potential to miscommunicate and conduct maybe methodologically poor research. Charities and civil society organisations I spoke to, they recognise there's a real need for qualitative insights and qualitative research as well, but they don't feel maybe skilled enough to challenge some of those ethical questions that do arise. And so there's a need, actually, I'd say, for anthropologists to engage in these. Otherwise, there is a danger in not doing so. And try to turn this on its head and encourage it, not as a dangerous thing, but as a real positive act. Another thing which is raised by, I think, charities and anthropologists alike, is no one listens unless it's stats. They hold such power in our lives, which is totally true, but it's a constant refrain which you hear from more qualitative researchers. But again, people really recognise there's a value for anthropological research. You hear from Ingrid and from a wealth of other organisations as well. But no one's actually going to really, unless you engage, no one's going to care about anthropological research. They will go for stats if they're easily communicated and easily accessible. And so, it's you often hear it's a chicken or the egg situation. Like, anthropology needs to be more respected before we get stuck in awe. We need to begin doing research to promote anthropology, but really, it's beyond debate now. You need to get stuck in and get farming, really. And finally, I think research is extractive. So this is more of a challenge to anthropology. And charities are often a gateway to conducting research on a particular group of people. And their time and expertise, it needs to be recognised as well, and as an opportunity to use that as well. But anthropology is also, by its very nature, collaborative, but often that collaboration is under the radar and it's not made explicit, or it's not well structured, and so it does tend to be extractive. And charities' time and effort which goes into nurturing relationships and ensuring people are reached during research, it's not actually paid back to them. And so Ingrid touched on this, but I think it's important to think of a potential public as not as an informant, but more as a peer researcher as well. And turning on to this sort of, how do we structure a collaborative research relationship? I think anthropologists have all the tools to do good public engagement. I know a training in anthropology has set me up incredibly well to conduct public engagement for natural sciences and for a range of social sciences. And those research skills are actually incredibly useful in that, and there's several ways in which go about The first one is definitely starting early, and this is something which I think can help combat that sort of extractive relationship, especially from the perspective of charities. And so, yeah, embed civil society from the beginning in your research, and make it collaborative from the get-go. And one way to do this is to get in touch early and write each other into your funding proposals. And so that means it's well resourced from the start. You can begin those conversations about whenever pinch points in your research, when is there opportunities to actually do impact and engage in bigger public conversations. It's also, this idea of developing a gift relationship, a key term in anthropology, and you can begin to find those shared questions and help each other out, rather than just trying to do your impact and trying to get the evidence to understand your intervention. And finally, it's starting early. You create champions for your work. These people will begin to promote your work for you. So, for instance, I've recently been working on a project about conspiracy theories, how to talk about conspiracy theories, and involving people in some user testing workshops. We've now got people who say they want to bring these resources into the gyms they own, into the youth clubs that they're running, and into the big science communication organizations as well. So by involving those people early, it's going to go out on a really grassroots level, but also through these larger institutions as well. Second is really know your audience. And I think because anthropology is so collaborative, it can sometimes be tricky when you're trying to separate the engagement aspect from the communication aspect. And so I think it's important initially to sit down and really think this through. And it also stops presuming that you know who your audience is, and by imagining that they will be interested, or there's just a public out there, and you can begin to specify exactly what that is. So, for instance, you might be conducting some research on refugees or asylum seekers interaction with the payment scheme, which we get. And, are you going to communicate to that specific support group that you're working with, help them understand their mechanisms and their understanding of, what's at stake? Or is it going to be in the local area or a regional area? Is it the food banks also, who are some of these asylum seekers as service users? Or going out more, actually, is local government, local news interested? The schools academy trusts, how can they better support the pupils who are also asylum seekers? And then, is there actually a more national impact here? Is this research going to be used for national advocacy organisations? And at each point, the way you communicate your findings and your expertise is going to change with that group. And so it's quite important to be specific early on as to who that is. And this moves on to how to communicate your research. So really, you can understand there's 3 types of users. So you might have user-led groups with really small charity, who lack maybe the knowledge or expertise to understand anthropological research. They might not find it relevant, or they might feel excluded actually from academia. Second, there's a group that they recognise the value and significance, but time poor. They feel excluded, so they're not going to engage. And then finally, you will have people who are well versed and are skilled professionals and who want to engage with your research. But I think the way to be able to communicate to these different groups is by layering information. And this is something which is really sort of promoted at Sense About Science, really. And so in every focus group I run, no matter who it is, no one cares about the research finding by itself. They want to know what's important for them. Why does it matter? Why should they listen to you? And that's really beginning to bring in the first group. Second, and this is what Ingrid and Danny and I think everyone's recognised in most of these anthropology communicates webinars, is that no jargon, no caveats, no complex terms. It's got to be straightforward. and it's got to be really accessible. And as part of that, you know, you can still embed further reading or further discussion throughout that as well, and so to reach those people who are well versed, who are skilled. And you can, you know, for example, hover over text, or as Danny said, you know, using endnotes and footnotes, so it doesn't clog up the main information, but it is there if people want it. And just thinking about this as well, someone in a workshop we ran recently talked about something being copy and pasteable. You know, when they're doing a funding application and they want a bit of a expert insight into what they're doing, they don't want to have to type out and rephrase what you're saying. It needs to be copy and pasteable. It needs to be something they can take away and put in a document in another context. And so it's a really important thing when you're thinking through how to write these more accessible resources, how people will be actually using them. And finally, I just took this, but I think user testing is just so invaluable, and it can be as formal as informal as you like. Even just get someone to read it before, and it will change your opinion of it. You know, often you get academics coming in and they always say, yeah, we want a really nice animation for sharing on social media. But through a user testing workshop, usually, you know, that can only really get so far, and people might want actually a bit more text, which they can copy and paste, or the animation's maybe not up to the job as such. So yeah, user testing, you know, there's lots of ways you can go about this, but it is a really important aspect. And then, so finally, talk about support. So, you know, there's tons of resources out there about doing public engagement, how to collaborate on research projects. And there's a whole host, you know, these 4 documents here, but type in public engagement and yeah, there's unbelievable amount of information out there. But I just wanted to finish off some questions, because I think there's still a lack of actually sort of a real relevant advice or support within anthropology. And so, you know, anthropologists or organizations go to a university and go to their public engagement department if they have one, or a policy department. But really there's little advice. And so what was brought up by a lot of organizations, I spoke to an anthropologist, you know, how can we showcase contributions anthropology makes? Should there be a single point of contact where people can get anthropological advice, or from where anthropologists can do outreach? A lot of organizations want to do qualitative research. And so is there a space where anthropologists can advise on this as well? Is there a route to do this? And also, public engagement is a relative new field. And as I said, anthropology is so well suited to sort of leading the way in best practice in this. And so, so how can we better communicate what anthropology can offer, and whose role it is to do that? Is it the Royal Anthropological Institute, for instance, or is it, you know, through universities and events like this as well? So, you know, Richard now, you know, lead us on to a discussion, but I thought it's useful here to sort of think about a wider sort of public engagement, you know, world out there, and where anthropology can fit in and also make an impact as well. But thank you very much.
Thank you, Alex, and thanks also, Danny and Ingrid. You, in a way, those presentations have left us with more questions than answers, which I think is good and appropriate. We have about an hour left for what would normally be a question and answer session, but I think, you know, we see this on this seminar series more in terms of an opportunity to share experiences or knowledge, or to comment on what you've heard, or to suggest ideas. So to continue the conversation that Danny, Alex and Ingrid have just started. We have on here, you can either put your questions in the chat, and some of them are already coming up there, or if you want to raise your hand and then actually ask your question in person, I think you go to the little emotions button, click on that, and there's a raise hand function there. So when I say raise hand, I don't mean put your hand up, I mean to go like that. I've done it. It worked, good. And that means you'll move to the front of the queue, and I'll be able to see who's putting their hands up and who's not. Second thing, can I just say it's really nice to see faces and to see people out there. So don't feel you have to, but if you'd like to turn your video on, it's always nice to see people. I can see a few familiar faces there. John, I can see you, and Hannah. Hi, Hannah. I think I saw Emma earlier. Yes, hi, Emma. So just going back to what Alex, you were saying, no one listens unless it's statistics, and I hear that a lot. You know, we've heard that about COVID. We've heard that in international development. Ingrid's point about you know, about value and the bottom line, and it's always cost effectiveness. That it's what I've talking to civil servants. It's what the Treasury analysis is that's most important. But the other thing we hear about is the need to have a good story to go with your statistics, to have something that's emotive, that explains, you know, in very personal terms, why something is important and why something needs to be done about it. And in between those two, I think we've got this potential for anthropology as a form of rigorous qualitative research that brings something new to the table. What it can tell us about the intangible, the unquantifiable. It's very good at telling us not so much what's happening, though it is very good at that, but how and why it's happening, how people make meaning of the world and why they act in the way they do. But that goes back to this issue of communication, and we need to communicate that better, and we need to think about how we communicate that. As Danny was saying, the way we use language, the audience we seek to influence, and how we think about that. And I think there's a further point here in terms of academic communication. How do our universities, how do the institutions we work in recognise value in what we do? You know, how do they reward what we do in terms of impact? You know, talking to someone a few weeks ago was saying, in terms of promotion and arguing for pay grades and so on, there's very little value in saying I achieved X, Y, and Z out there if you haven't achieved it in terms of your publication record. So I think it's also, you know, thinking about the challenges, but also the restrictions on the way we work and what we can do. So we have questions coming up, and shall we start with Joe? If I see you've got your hand raised, if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thanks very much. I really enjoyed all of those presentations, and a lot resonated. I'm research and policy lead at Scottish Autism, so I don't work necessarily with civil society, I work within it. I work within a charity. And I know a lot of colleagues here, I can see, work within different organizations. So I was just thinking about the kind of metaphors we use and the terms we use about engagement. We often talk about working with, we talk about the world out there. We use these metaphors of impact, translation, and often there's a kind of implicit assumption that anthropologists are located somewhere, and that somewhere is usually a university, and civil society is over here, and we sort of have to join them up. And since that's increasingly changing, since a lot of people like me work in different organizations, you know, I think much more about having anthropological conversations within my organization, promoting reflective practice among practitioners and so on. So I just wonder, a sort of challenge for all of us is wonder if we need to rethink the sort of metaphors we think about when we talk about engagement, impact, those things. But also institutionally, do we need to change things? Is that about training, what we think about in terms of publication? I thought Annie was really insightful about that. RAI, how do we promote this understanding of anthropologists being out there themselves sometimes? So that's my thought, really.
Thank you, Joe. I don't know if do any of the panel, would you like to respond to that, or also respond to the other presentations we've heard?
I mean, firstly, to agree, I think one of the problems is that institutionally, anthropology is essentially, mostly in universities, mostly involved in the training of student anthropologists. And it hasn't been the case that this kind of engagement has any kind of natural place within the range of teaching. So one of the things, I'm at Anthropology UCL, one of the things I think that, I can't remember when it started, but I think it was actually very valuable, is we started a seminar series in which we brought in anthropologists who'd been trained, then worked in, if you like, civil society in a whole different range of different capacities, to come back and describe what it was like. Now, at one level, I think some of the stories that came out, particularly ones who were then working subsequently in commerce, I think was, yes, an eye-opener, but also quite difficult to get in with. But at least there was that dialogue. It meant that you were already having a sense of what happens when anthropologists just get employed and are actually doing a range of jobs, which could well be in with NGOs, but it also could be with commerce. And I think that's something that we probably do want to continue to promote, because the problem is, if you're just a student studying anthropology, you really don't necessarily have the work experience, the sense of what it is actually like to be involved in, say, a commercial or charitable organization, and that makes it difficult. So having that direct dialogue, and to be honest, you could even possibly think about doing it the other way around, having actually anthropologists coming and say, well, this is the context in which we work, these are the values by which we're judged, and this is sort of like a bit like why we are the way we are. But I think it could potentially be a much better part of training, and in as much as it started to get incorporated into our curriculum, I think it's been a good shift.
Alex, I mean, maybe you would like to talk to that as someone who is currently studying anthropology at Manchester. How much do you feel, that there is I mean, obviously the sense of soft skills being passed on and methods and so on, but how is there still the assumption that essentially you're being trained to become an academic anthropologist, or what opportunities are there to extend engagement with a world outside the university?
Yeah, so I think, yeah, it's totally right. An anthropologist is at the moment someone in the academy, in a university department, or it's the anthropologist has some really great soft skills, which they can bring to their career. And I know I've used those soft skills, such as being able to talk to people, for example, or being able to listen to people. These are great skills anthropologists have, or how to see something going on in society from a different perspective. But what I don't think there is, and what I think could be nurtured and and communicated more effectively, is what anthropology is. What does anthropological evidence look like? How do you ask questions about it? So if you are a civil society organization and an anthropologist, you read some anthropological research, or you see an insight, how do you go, okay, so is that good? Is it bad? I don't think those questions really exist. And so being an anthropologist in an organization at the moment, it's either you're an academic trying to engage, or you've got soft skills. It's you can't bring your research and back, it's not robust enough almost to be able to be brought into a public context.
Yeah. Ingrid.
Yeah, just briefly, because I'm not an anthropologist, but I love Joe's idea of just being really clear that anthropologists are among us. They're not somewhere else. They're part of society and part of making change happen, and part of critiquing the ways in which we do that. I think that's important for all science. I think it's important for people to realize how many different skills, academic or otherwise, there exist in civil society. There's a historical tendency to think of civil society as do-gooders, and do-gooding is the thing that sets us apart. And of course, that's not it. It's a professional. There are professional sectors, but there are different skills and kind of capabilities that come into that. And I like the idea of anthropological conversations, but as Alex says, we just need to do a bit more public engagement about what anthropological conversations look like. Societies and communities have them all the time. There are social scientists everywhere in communities, trained or not, because you only have to work in a neighborhood organization to realize just how much that nosy gossip longer down the road is the key person you need to understand all the relationships in a place, because they're the ones who ask the right questions and probe the right kind of levers. So I think it's important to harness all these anthropological skills wherever they come from.
Going back, yeah, absolutely. And I think as well that the point about what anthropologists do, you know, and who we are and what sort of evidence we provide, there's a sense that anthropologists have become more hidden away. You know, if you look back to the 1940s or 50s or 60s, there were public anthropologists, there were TV programs about anthropology. We see much less of that now. I think maybe as whether it's due to a lack of confidence or recognition of, you know, the inherent political nature of engagement, anthropologists seem to have become more, as Danny said, more pure and critical and conceptual, engaging in particular ways, but not engaging in others. So thank you, Joe, for your question, and I hope this is a conversation we can, an anthropological conversation we can continue beyond this. I see I've got questions from Helen and Emma, but if you don't mind, I'll take one from the chat now, from Hannah. Hannah asks, hang on, it varies depending on the specific context, but in general, in your experience, how can anthropologists have a clear return on investment for charities when budgets are tight? Ingrid, do you want to start us off with that?
Yeah, and I think it's difficult, especially at the moment. Money is really tight. Trusts and foundations and commissioners always want evaluations, evidence of impact, and often that means that charities spend that bit of their funding on charity evaluators. So people who will do usually a mixed method evaluation of impact based on some metrics that a funder has mandated. However, the best evaluations of charity impact that I see are mixed discipline teams from local universities. So where there's already a relationship with a local university and a charity, that often it's quite cost effective. Sometimes there's a mix of funding, both, you know, the charity brings some evaluation funding and the university brings some research funding, and those work really well. I think they're rare though, because those relationships are rare. I think what Alex was saying, which is building charities into your research, is obviously that's a different pot of money, and that's probably a better way of showing value for money. I think there have to be a few proof of concept pieces of work to show the value before commissioners and funders start to kind of come on board. There are some trusts and foundations who are much, much better about understanding the value of things. I'm not sure about anthropology, but other type of disciplines, to understand mechanisms, especially, rather than just, you know, quantifiable impact and outcome evaluations. I think it's growing, but yeah, it's tough at the moment.
Alex, Danny, would you like to add to what Ingrid said?
Alex?
Yeah, I think Ingrid touched on it, but, you know, it's happening with a lot of other disciplines. But yeah, I think because, you know, anthropology is not really getting out there, we can't showcase what's possible. And so I think, you know, as I said, you know, during my presentation, need to begin like doing stuff and shouting about it, and, you know, potentially RAI shouting about it as well. You know, so there's something people can really draw on there. And I think just, you know, impact's increasingly becoming a bigger part of funding in academia as well. And so although it can be challenging sometimes in order to write an external partner into your funding bid, it's only increasingly going to be more important as well. So, you know, hopefully as time develops, it will become a bit more straightforward.
And I just wanted to add one thing that I forgot, which is going back to Alex's point about, is there a need for a single point of entry or single point of contact, like a matchmaking service? Things like that have been tried for other disciplines. A couple of disciplines, I think, have really kind of stuck their neck out and tried to do something specifically for charities. Pro bono economics springs to mind. You know, if you think anthropologists have a bad reputation in civil study, economists are like at the bottom, but pro bono economics went out there and said, well, we're gonna show the value we have to charities. And then groups like Statisticians for the Public Good, where a bunch of data people, especially in the civil service, who just want to have something meaningful to do as a volunteer or as part of some of their work hours, can go towards this, have set up this kind of matchmaking shop as well for charities. So I think it's possible.
Just to add to that, I mean, we're not necessarily a cost. One of the ways of envisaging this is that we work in institutions where people have to write dissertations. And actually, if you create a dialogue between something like a charitable organization in the long term and a relevant degree, so for example, our digital anthropology program is relevant to very specific interests around the new media. A lot of our students would be only too happy to be doing work that they also feel is likely to be of benefit, and that and to be involved in an evaluation, and then in turn they can use it within their own degree program. Now, I will admit that this is not surprisingly not the first time something like that has been suggested. And over the years, I've seen these things kind of come and go. They are easier to say than to do in practice. But I do think it is a genuine possibility. It actually does, as it were, save money. It does give us practice also in evaluation. And you could bring together longer term, and that's what you want really, longer term relationships between the two sectors which we're talking about. The other point is actually, I mean, the initiatives I've been involved in recently, in contrast to what you might expect, the suggestions we've been making around mHealth, etc., all designed to save money. We're basically suggesting ways things could be done in health which would not involve the costs. The problem is, I still think it goes back to something I was trying to say earlier, that it's still the charities will have the thing that they want, as you, Ingrid, was saying, this is what we want from anthropologists. If we have something that in a sense they haven't necessarily thought about because it's an original kind of research outcome that we ourselves also haven't anticipated, it's so difficult to come with that and actually say, you know, here's something that could help you, because it's not actually fitting into these agendas. And that's something I still find, you know, just from my own experience, because I have tried to do this. I have tried to get actually charities involved from early on in our research, as Alex suggested. It can really, even with the best will in the world, it can actually be very difficult in practice.
Thank you. Hannah and Alex, I just want to thank you as well, because I think it was your idea. You raised the idea of this Anthropology Communicate series about probably about a year ago. You came up with the idea, and you know, this is an opportunity to shout about the value of anthropology and highlight what contributions can be made. And I think, you know, it's become one of the highlights of my month, and we've had such a varied set of contributions. So thanks to the two of you for coming up with this. One of the brilliant things about Zoom is you can put your hand up and leave it up for quite a long time without your arm aching. And I think, Helen Lambert, you've had your hand up for at least 15 minutes virtually. So would you like now, yes, to unmute yourself. Hi, Helen.
Hi, thank you very much. This is a really marvellous seminar, and I'm sorry that I haven't been able to make previous ones if it's as good as this. I guess I wanted to pick up on a couple of threads from things that Danny and Alex and Ingrid have said relating to issues of evidence and extraction, and it also links to what you said, our chair, about the training of student anthropologists. So I'm a professor of medical anthropology. You know, I have a proper DPhil in social anthropology from Oxford, but I've spent my entire career working in departments of public health outside departments of anthropology. And when I, as it were, look back to or reconnect with peers in anthropology, I'm increasingly frustrated every time with the obscurity of their language and their inability to translate their own concepts into understandable terms. And I think this really relates to the issues about engaging with civil society. People have talked in this seminar already about the importance of not using jargon and so forth. But yeah, I wrote a paper about a decade ago in Anthropology Today, trying to kind of reach a wider audience, which I'm sure was completely ignored, but it was about evidence, with the rise at that point of evidence-based medicine, which has turned into evidence-based everything. And Ingrid, I think, pointed to that requirement. But it seems to me that this question about what does anthropological evidence look like is one that we need to engage with much better as anthropologists and articulate that much more coherently. And at the moment, it seems to me that what student anthropologists are being trained to do is to translate their qualitative research findings, their understanding, into anthropological language, but not vice versa, not out of it. And so I take exception even with the idea that, there's statistics and then there's anthropology, and we need to have our space for anthropology. Anthropologists should be perfectly capable of engaging with emerging statistical evidence and providing an account of why those statistics look like they do. I mean, I have no statistical training, but over the years, these are languages. We're anthropologists. We should be good at learning other people's languages. This is just another language that we could potentially engage with. And we'd be much better at, talking to our colleagues and interlocutors in charities and in the public sector if we could do that better. Sorry, it's just a long comment really, rather than but I really feel strongly about this, and it enrages me when anthropologists seem to think, I mean, Danny obviously has a huge amount of experience, but even you referred to, when you were talking about your colleague or student who'd written a paper with lots of data in it, you said she was willing to make the compromise. I don't think that's a compromise. I think it's a skill.
So again, the point that we're very good at learning other people's languages, but only when facing in particular directions. Danny, do you want to speak to that? I mean, I think your work is incredibly accessible.
Why is it? Yes, I mean, obviously, I couldn't agree more about accessibility. In the book series that we do, there's a general rule: you're not allowed to use a term that is not colloquial, full stop. So that any sixth former should be able to read our books without a problem. And I do think that's one of the, that's why you get 1 million downloads. It's not just even for the applied side, just to engage with the world. You need to have accessibility. But to answer Helen's final point, I mean, actually, I think it is a compromise. The problem is this, that anthropology does have a different sensibility. So let's take somebody like Charlotte's work. When we are looking at our material, and we have some evidence around, say, smartphone use in a different Kampala situation, which this was, we would look at the quantitative material and we would find it very problematic. We know that actually different people are answering questions in different ways, they're not directly commensurable, that actually the quantitative is something that we actually have difficulty with because in some sense we actually think it's untrue. It distorts, it creates biases towards that which is measurable as against that which isn't. We all know this and we all make these critiques. So I think we should recognize that actually, if we are then going into another setting and somebody says, I don't want to know anything about any of that, I just want to know your figures, right? There is a reason why we look at that askance. We say, but if you know that in order to have that engagement and in order to actually promote alongside that other body something that you think is very worthwhile, you make the compromise and you say, I'll swallow my kind of butt and actually I will engage to some extent in the way. And I think though we have to admit that these are difficult processes. They do involve compromises, I believe. Doesn't mean we can't comment on other people's statistical materials, which I think we do constantly, but we do have issues when it comes often to the representation of our material and the translation between qualitative and quantitative forms. I think sometimes, as indeed, accessible language also can simplify. There's no point, I think, denying the contradictions that are involved in these forms of engagement, but I think they are justifiable. That would be my point. I actually think compromise is a good thing because in the end, we want certain results which benefit the welfare of populations. And in another journal context, we might say, actually, we recognize all these difficulties in this, what we see as partially a misrepresentation of our material as data, but nevertheless. So that would be the way I see it. I actually do see it as a compromise.
Thanks, Danny. I'm seeing 5 raised hands, and I'm also seeing a lot of questions in the chat. So I hope the panel doesn't mind if in some instances I direct a question to one panel member, not the others. And if you do want to chip in, then let me know. And similarly, if you're asking the questions and you just want to ask one panel member, can you just let me know either in the chat or when you ask your question? Which brings us to Emma.
Yes, thank you, Rich. Just to continue the conversation, I think why it's really appropriate to have these kinds of discussions rather than a point of contact where a person or maybe a committee like ours would say, this is what anthropology is, this is the value of it, this is how we should engage, is exactly because it's extremely complex to come up even with insights to the questions that you've posed. So surely that what you're saying, Danny, and what you're saying, Helen, partly arises because you're navigating slightly different worlds. And we are so crazily ambitious, anthropologists, that we feel like we can enter any world and get into conversation with other disciplines, with other forms of evidence. So we're in conversation with legal kinds of evidence and scientific and film and all, you know. So I once wrote what I now think is a rather pathetic framework, which was trying to describe how researchers, including anthropologists, might engage with policymakers and others. And it had kind of three elements to it. The sort of idea was, to engage, you need to understand your context, you need to create the right kind of links, and then you need to think about what kind of evidence you need. The problem with it is that it's really quite sort of banal, because really the interesting bit is in the detail of what kind of links and what kind of evidence. So sometimes you're really in an antagonistic position with the people you're trying to influence, the government now on ODA cuts, whereas other times, you might be really working incredibly collaboratively with people. Or actually, Ingrid, you got me thinking about theory of change, because I could see how in your example, that using that theory of change as a sort of facilitative process to get people thinking about their intentions might work. But in international development, where I used to work, the whole gamut of project cycle methodologies, including theory for change, were, I would say, deeply pernicious, because they were used as a way of making decisions in urban centres, you know, even more so in the global north than in the global south, and confining and restricting how much decision making could be made in the very sort of more grassroots levels that you're talking about in rural Uganda or wherever. So I think there is an immense specificity to what anthropology is, how we describe it, how it's valued. And if I could just give a final example, and just to, I mean, I absolutely love the way you write, Danny, and the way you've got such a commitment to accessibility. But I can even find an exception there, because working with parliamentary officials, when I'm trying to explain anthropology, and they say to me, well, it's very clear you're not a kind of Anunnaki train spotter. You know, you're coming up with really, you're coming up with stories about Parliament that resonate with us. You're talking about our experience, but sort of, they're kind of saying, how do you get away with it? Where's the rigor in what you're doing? But to them, I talk about, you know, reflexivity and interdisciplinarity and the importance of plurality, because they assume all MPs are the same, or they used to. So even there, I think one does have to be careful about kind of doing research about one's audience to decide how one's going to communicate with them. Sorry, I'm going to shut up.
Thanks, Emma. When I handed over to you, my internet cut out, so I missed most of that, I'm afraid. Who wants?
His internet's
to
cut
keep
out
my internet
again.
long enough.
All right.
Danny?
I mean, I don't think it was.
You look like you've been unmuted.
No, I don't think it was something that I think you were looking at. I mean, I absolutely agree with what you said. I think it's been said a few times recently that essentially the devil is in the details, that it is about specific, that there's a great variety of different interactions. So what does a webinar like this do? Because it can't engage with all those different specificities. What I think it does do is really talk in a sense about attitude. That actually that we are collectively trying to demonstrate and create a willingness to have this kind of dialogue. Goes back to what I was saying about compromise, accessibility, etc., etc. How then that gets realized in any given situation will be that diversity and specificity that you just referred to. It won't be the same in Parliament that it will be in somewhere else. But I think we have to try, and we will be critiqued in exactly the way you said. I remember years ago when I was trying to make that suggestion about Facebook losing its popularity with young people, and I had no data. And I was going on the news, etc., said, but where's your data? And that means you're useless. But in the end of the day, 3 years down the line, everybody can see Facebook lost its cool, and at least they might turn around and say, actually the anthropologists may not have had data, but it turned out they actually knew what the hell was going on. And I think that's why we just keep at it. And if our work is decent and it is scholarly, and we are actually allowing people an understanding of what's going on, then we will get recognition for the value of what we do.
I'm just going to say something while Richard's not here to stop me, which is just a kind of an overall point about all of this, which is that decisions are going to be made anyway. In policy, in charities, people are going to plan programs, interventions, they're going to spend a lot of money on policies. They're going to do it whether you engage with them, and I mean you, I also mean me, whether we engage with them or not. We can only influence that if we're in the room. Being in the room, I think, can be done in different ways and different levels of engagement, different levels of effort on both sides. But that's why we do this. It's going to happen anyway. We want to ensure that it's evidence informed, regardless of the discipline we come from. Not evidence-based, that's not what we're aiming for, I think, anymore, but evidence-informed. But being in the room takes different shapes and forms, whether you're speaking to policy or practice or different audiences. So that's just, I think, something to bear in mind overall.
Has Richard left the building?
His Wi-Fi is
temporarily. Really, yeah. Shall I take over, Hanine? I mean. Yes,
I would say maybe for now take over. I'm texting with him to see if we can get him back.
Okay, great. Okay, good. I sit with Rich on the Anthropology of Policy and Practice Committee at the RAI, and I work with him. That's why I'm stepping in. But the only problem now is that I wasn't keeping an eye on who was first of those with their hands up. So Cecilia, you're first in my list, is that right?
Well, actually, the list
yes.
is Alexi is first, and then Cecilia, and then we have.
Okay. I don't know when you decide.
Okay, Alexi, you're first. Go for it.
Thanks. I just wanted to share with you the perspective from the field in developing countries or in the country's transitional economy. I work for the UN in Ukraine, and I'm a graduate from the Masters in Anthropology and Development Management from LSE. It's been a very interesting journey over the past 2 years to see how actually anthropologists are being seen from inside such a huge system as the UN. And what I wanted to mention is that comparatively, it's very hard to sell anthropology because it lacks some of the things, and I mean like institutionally. To contribute to add on Alex's quote on that, nobody listens unless it's statistics. I would say that it's actually in UN system, it's nobody listens unless it's pie charts. And now there is a big drive to big data and behavioral science. So what we are buying as an insight actually comes from mostly from surveys. Is I would say it's 90% of my perception, my bias probably. Mostly it's surveys. And then now it's kind of like bit by bit, big data or anything that can be quoted as big data, and behavioral insight kind of steps in. Anthropology is kind of seems to be stuck in the domain of academia, and it's very hard to dig it out into real consultancy work as we work with it. Because even if we engage any partner from the sociology, with sociological methodology or behavioral science, it's never academia. It's always consultancy companies that are very fast, that are very user-oriented, they have customer departments and so on, and they never have anthropologists as a core sales point. So it's been very hard for me to push inside, even if I'm an insider and I will know how much of a value can anthropology bring. It's very hard to say, these guys are doing strong things in anthropology, and that would be sufficient to make a policy advice. So mostly we reach out, there is a survey company that say, we will do it in 1 month, you will have wonderful insights, pie charts, policy advisory, and so on. And it's hard to say no to that. So we have to kind of like have this reality check on what is actually there on the market. And also, as a graduate of the anthropology degree, I would say that we bring a huge value by integrating into the system. And yesterday I was reviewing one of the tasks for the HR policy, and just because they don't know the qualitative tools and specifically anthropology, for Richard, we didn't have any shows about social anthropology. People in Ukraine, post-Soviet countries, they don't know what is social anthropology. It's been a very hot topic, it's new. And everyone, like, there are so many people who call themselves anthropologists, but they probably don't even know what it is. So it's a huge mess. We've never had it on the TV. There was always in the Soviet Union, there was a statistics department that was counting heads and kind of making predictions and so on. So it's been kind of a shaky road to, even if I contributed to some program design as an anthropologist, it's very hard to say I did it because I'm an anthropologist. They say, oh, it's Alexei who did it. So I kind of have to, I struggle to bring this institution and the toolkit and the methodology with me and say, it's this, and we should have more of this. It's been challenging, yeah. So just to share with you the insights from the UN system.
Really interesting. Thank you very much. I'm going to hand back to Rich now that I see he's back, which is great. But since you missed that, Rich, I'll just see whether or not Alex wants to say anything, because I think he alluded to your points. And also Alex's points relate to some interesting questions in the chat from Hannah Lewin about anthropology being under the radar and how we increase its value and recognition. Did you want to say anything to that, Alex? Or yeah?
Yeah, I think there's a real benefit of sort of talking about anthropology and the soft skills it can bring to a charitable organization and things like that. And I think those are really important, and it's really good to shout about those as, just as, the scientific method is useful for, problem solving. And so, those are the soft skills. But if you're a biologist working for an environmental charity, it's not really the sort of, the soft scientific skills or that training as such that you're bringing, but it's actually a way to use your understanding of biology and its relationship to the environment and evidence to inform that. And I think that's where maybe anthropology, it's harder to shout about, because it's harder to say, okay, well, this is the anthropological insight here. This is the little nugget of anthropology, and this is what I am bringing to the table, not a sort of insight to that. And I think you can see it in data science, which you touched on, and it's like, well, we can bring an insight, and yeah, if it works, then great, look at us. But increasingly, people are wanting to know, open up the black box and understand the mechanisms of data science applications. And I think what would be useful is to open up the black book of the anthropologist. So the little black book which they take on their ethnographic fieldwork, and all their data is stored inside, but which you can never ask a question about, and you're never taught how to analyze. And so to be able to ask questions about anthropological research and evidence, I think we need to be much more clearer about the methodologies used. And there, you know, I think we begin to get away from this sort of, you know, just maverick insight, or great contribution, but we manage to, you know, instill rigor with it because we're being open about our research methods. We're not black boxing it, which I think often is the case. You know, been quite provocative, I imagine, but I've never heard an anthropologist refer to their field notes as a way to back up their claims as a student of anthropology.
I'm back. Thanks, Emma, for taking over there. And I don't know what happened. As a very social anthropologist, it was odd. I missed you all, but back now. And really interesting to hear Alex's point there. You know, that sense, again, going back to the idea of the social anthropologist and how antisocial we can sometimes be. The idea that we go off alone into the field and very secretive about what we do there and who we interact with and how we record our notes. Our field notes are very, very private. Obviously, they're provisional, so they don't always have the final insights, but you know, they're very personal, and that might be a reason for not sharing. But I think there is something to be said about more collaborative research by anthropologists and by anthropologists working with others. And it's something I'd certainly like to see. I think the idea of the lone anthropologist is one that is so problematic and needs to be very much rethought. We have about 20 minutes left. I think the next question was going to come from Cecilia.
Yes, no, I have a completely different experience, like Alex was commented in America Latina and Spain, and even here, I think it's not this band of anthropologists and charities. The conflict is something completely normal, and this translation is the way to go on the bridge and to make a project, to participate in the elaboration of the data as well. When I worked in Amazonia, I remember that many people used to say, many indigenous, oh, these anthropologists wanted to tell us how to live. And many indigenous could make perfectly the differences, and the loneliness of anthropology is a part of our being as well. It's a part of our identity. If we read Malinowski, or not only Malinowski, because we have this inside and outside as part of the participant observation, but we are not the enemies or the enemy of the people. The problem, I think, is as well the context, the political situations. Not only is the money, is the attitude, how we are working. And for example, I am a PhD in anthropology of food. Food inside the discipline was completely subestimated after, thanks to Audrey Richards, that stopped that, no? And but as well became an exotic. That is a process that it happens, and we have to know how to knit with that. I remember Mary Douglas in France saying in a conference to the nutritionists, you are going to listen the reasons why your patients don't follow your prescriptions and diets, and you're not going to be agreed. Because there are many taboos, there are many walls, and it's our work as well to describe them. Now I am very concerned about the food in the schools in this moment, not only, and what is going on. And there are a lot of charities, but in my opinion, some are trying to be more or less nearby the way to give maybe a training to change the situation, to listen, but most of them is the guilty on the cookers, or nobody know. They don't want to listen. It's a taboo. So, and I consider it is very important, the public vision of the discipline, how was cut it by Cameron, and it's a long period of time, 2017 to now, and young people as well that could receive that information, and maybe this translation and communication with all the conflicts that is completely, we have to normalize that. It can be a right, but now we have other problems. And anthropology, in my opinion, has a lot of limits. That's all, no?
Thank you, Cecilia. Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, one of the interesting things about these events is just realizing what those limits are. I think the more we reach out and listen to different sets of perspectives, we realize, you know, the limits of what we're doing are, and where, you know, what we could do more. I'm going to suggest we sort of move through. I've got three raised hands. The other thing was, when I disappeared for a while, all the questions that were in chat, I can't see anymore. They've all disappeared. So what I'd suggest is, Ingrid, Alex, and Danny, if you want to look through the chat, and if there's any questions you'd like to respond to, perhaps, you know, you could select any questions you'd like to respond to and do that. But first, can we go to Giovanna? You've had your hand raised for some time, so Giovanna, can I hand over to you?
Good afternoon. I'm from Italy, and I'm happy to be here and listen about the network that can be organized with the help of charities. And charities made me think about my first experience in researching abroad after my degree in anthropology about African art, and in particular in Burundi. I was there for 2 years in Burundi, thanks to a charity. I was working with a charity, and the charity helps the volunteers to do a big network with not only with the association, but also with the local Ministry of Education, because I was working in a school in Burundi, and also with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Italy, and also with the university where I got my degree. And it was a wonderful experience. But only now I have understood that I was engaged in this activity, in this kind of work. But when I came back to Europe, it seems that what you have done, engaging your life outside the university, was not the same, was not as valuable as the activity inside universities. After this wonderful experience in Burundi, where I was part of a big equipe of teachers, local teachers, indigenous teachers, and Italian teachers. It was the first training from an Italian school and a school of Burundi. After that, I decided I wanted to be engaged, and I worked for many years for the Ministry of Education, the European Commission. And so I had the possibility to do many things I wanted to do to improve the relation with the other cultures. The problem was that no one called me anthropologist, and sometimes I found out that there was a lack of knowing what anthropology is, but the skills I had was very important to improve the quality of activities in this network. So my question, when I came back, I have to thank the Royal Anthropological Institute, Joy Hendry and Emma Ford, David Schenkler, because they were the first people I met that have understood that in my life I was engaged. But when I spoke to other anthropologists, it seems that I had done nothing. When I proposed something about my experience of a person engaged in for many years abroad, it seems that I had done nothing. So my question is, can we continue? What can we do to continue this work of bridging schools, institutions, charities, and also universities. So I think it's a big work we are doing, and also the speakers were for me like a way of recognizing that the first work I did, the 2 years in Burundi, maybe were the best experience. And I would like to do like Joy Hendry that shows the film, and now also I saw she wrote a book about her experience. My dream is to go back to this experience and document what I have done. And I thank the anthropologist with which I am working, the open mind anthropologist, because not everybody are like this. So thank you to you all. And I hope this bridge continues. Thank you.
Thank you, Giovanna. Yes, I like the metaphor of the bridge. I think it might be interesting, Danny, if you could talk a little bit about the constraints that as academic anthropologists we are under in terms of our ability to engage in terms of time and so on. And Alex, it might be interesting to hear more from you about your new role and how you intend to be a bridge, hopefully, for anthropologists to achieve impact.
Yeah, I mean, I think if we're trying to be empathetic to everyone else, maybe we also need to be empathetic to the plight of anthropologists. And anybody who's been teaching this year knows what I mean, in the sense that people have really struggled. They do have so many commitments, and this involves the teaching commitments, the administrative commitments, and it is very difficult to get recognition for these other kinds of work that we might want to be engaged in. I mean, I'll give you, again, an example of my own experience. We have now this thing called impact. And the idea, in a way, would have been that the government can then give respect to that. Now, trouble is, as so often happens with these things, my project is not being included, is not an impact example. I actually think we've had a vast amount of impact, but these audits work with very tight protocols. And then what happens is you hire impact experts who tell you what the exact protocols are. And if you don't fit that, then you can't be actually, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that means, once again, you're only valued if you happen to fit a particular niche of evaluation. And that comes with our teaching, with our admin, and with everything else. And if you talk about, the constraints we work under, I think we all have that experience, and we would want to be sympathetic to ourselves to some degree, that it is actually quite a hard world now. And certainly, as I've seen it over the years, it has become harder for anthropologists working in their institutions because of the level of pressure. And a lot of that pressure, in a sense, takes you away from what you'd wish to be doing. So what I'm implying here is the impact protocol often gets in the way of actually having impact. I was saying earlier, the ethics protocols actually get in the way if you're actually trying to do good. And these are the kind of dilemmas that we face. I don't want to end there. I mean, I think the whole point of this dialogue is to find ways of saying, notwithstanding that, we still want to overcome that, and actually, because in the end of the day, a lot of us do want to be involved with charities and do good in the world. But if you ask, do we have constraints? Yes, we have constraints.
Alex.
Yeah. So in terms of building bridges. So yeah, my new role, it's actually my last day at Centre About Science today, but I'm going into a new role as the network manager of a university's policy engagement network. So that's 80 universities, and helping them engage with policymaking in the UK. And you can see there's a real, the public engagement, policy engagement landscape, it's new and it's developing, and lots of people are trying out lots of different things. But you can see real attempts by certain institutions and networks like UPenn in order to create, systems and structures in order to facilitate this engagement. And I think it's good for lots of people to be going out there and trying it their own. But I think one thing which I think is great about the Policy and Practice Committee and events like these is beginning to imagine, okay, what structure and support is needed to do this effectively. It's good to have this debate around it, but then also, what mechanisms are needed to support anthropologists, to understand what their anthropological insight is, what the policy implications of their research is, which publics they should engage with. These are all questions, and lots of different learned societies, and universities will have, public engagement and staff and professionals there to aid that. And so, yeah, I think, to build bridges, you can build personal ones, but I think, you can see it in the public engagement world, but, more formal and organized structures are being used to support academics in a range of areas.
Thanks, Alex. We're rapidly running out of time, unfortunately. I feel like this could go on a lot longer. If I could ask Daryl and then Hannah, they've both had their hands up for some time. Daryl, are you still there?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Hi. Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah. So I'm going to try and turn on my camera as I talk. So I'm Daryl Stelmach. I'm like Helena Deefil in anthropology, who's also spent his whole time in public health. I'm currently the anthropology advisor for MSF, Médecins Sans Frontières, which is Doctors Without Borders. I'm one of them. There are about a dozen social scientists working in the organization as social scientists and anthropologists. So I just wanted to say, yes, we do exist. And yes, there is a place for anthropology in these complex charities. We provide classic anthropological insight on health problems in communities, but also explicitly written into our charter as a social science team is the idea of providing strategic insight to the institution, i.e. critiquing the institution itself from the perspective of anthropology. And that's explicitly recognized. So the value of anthropology has been recognized. It has been developed within that team, and it's working. How this all came about, I think it was a very long process. It started with a couple of people, nurses, who retrained as anthropologists and then agitated over the period of 10 years within the organization to build a space larger and larger for this group. Now we have an established social science team. We're actively recruiting outside anthropologists to come in. So we started with insiders, now we're recruiting outsiders. And to speak a bit to Alex's point about unboxing the black box, that's how we spent most of the first 10 years, is really explaining methods, explaining evidence and validity and how it can be made to work within these settings. That has now been achieved, and we now have this place where we are a small team of there's a dozen of us within an institution of 70,000 people globally, but we punch above our weight, and we do have the outsized influence for the size of the team. So it can be done, and I'm happy to discuss offline more how to go about this strategically within smaller charities and other groups. Thanks.
Thank you, Darryl. I'm just looking at John Borton, and I think we're probably thinking similar thoughts, because we did have the idea to have one of these sessions with MSF. So yes, it'd be great if we could continue this conversation perhaps offline. Hannah, do you want to, I'm sorry, the time is very short, so if you want to sort of
yeah, I'll keep it very, very brief.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much to everyone who spoke. It's been so hugely interesting. And I think what keeps coming up in these talks is how pervasive in lots of different areas these challenges are across, civil society and many of the other fields anthropologists find themselves. Something that keeps coming up that was mentioned before was this idea that we aren't collecting data and other people do data and we do something else. And that's something that I have to be kind of fighting against in my job constantly, because I'm a qualitative researcher, and I'm going to share with you a Twitter image of someone, may I say, a survey methodologist sent me. And I think this is what the perception is of what we are versus surveys. We're this flamboyant, is sort of nice to have, that's this, if you've got the budget and maybe you're happy to have these fluffy things, and then the data, the numbers is where you get the sort of facts. And I feel like it's really our job to try and, whilst have the integrity of really, wading in that gray space and not just boiling it down to like top 5 pithy insights, which maybe a product team or whatever team really wants, but also staying true to what anthropology is, which is answering some of those more challenging questions. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that we're all wading through this and we're all experiencing the same things. And that's kind of nice to know, hearing Danny say that he also feels like, wow, that's good that I'm not the only one. But I do think that it's a challenge to feel like we're staying true to anthropology whilst also being helpful and, achieving impact in whatever form we want to and that our sort of stakeholders need. So I'm sure it'll come up again in another talk.
Thank you, Hannah. I did click on the photo. I do recognise myself in that.
I think the reality is we all do. That's the sad thing.
I have 2 apologies to make. One, that we're slightly running over time, and I hope that's okay with you, Haneen. We'll maybe just take a few minutes to conclude. Also, apologies for not really going through the questions in the chat. As I said, I lost them when my internet cut out. But maybe Alex, Ingrid and Danny, this will be a chance for you. If there's any of those questions in the chat that you would like to address before we conclude. Danny, I don't think so. Alex?
So, well, it's just that to listen to people, I couldn't also, to be honest with that. But I would say just thanks to the last speaker, because I think he actually did sum up the way we feel and the struggle that we have and the reasons why we want to get on with it. Yeah. Ingrid.
Yeah, I got distracted in the chat because there's so much interesting stuff in there. So I'm glad, Haneen, that you're gonna save it. I've got my reading list has exponentially grown. So thank you very much for people who recommended books and papers in the chat. That's been great. Just very, very quickly on Hannah's point, when we collect evidence on what works, it's qualitative as well. It's not just quant by any means. And we have established methods for grading qualitative evidence and systematic reviews. So it's all in there. There's no reason why anthropology papers shouldn't be part of our systematic reviews. So that's part of our method. It's our job as well to say to policymakers, to say to charities and employers, you can't just rely on quant. it doesn't tell you enough. It doesn't tell you how or why something works. It doesn't tell you how to translate between a very context-specific intervention to a different context. You need some of those other gold nuggets. And also just very briefly, I was so interested in Cecilia's point about food anthropology, because food comes up everywhere in charities as kind of this lubricating force for interventions to work, to the extent that Spirit of 2012 were a major funder of charitable activities. One of their gold nuggets, one of their key mechanisms for impact is tea and biscuits. They've looked across all of their evaluations and they've said, you know what stands out? Everybody says tea and biscuits is an essential part of this group and that activity and this event. And it's the sort of thing that quantitative evaluators might miss, or people who don't understand very much about mechanisms, about social interactions might think it's a kind of a not so relevant aspect to the activity. But of course, I think an anthropology, a food anthropology especially, might say, oh yeah, of course, because food has this role and that role, and, you know, gets over this barrier and that barrier. So it's just something to bear in mind. There are little ways into some of these big topics that people are worrying about.
Alex, over to you.
I'd be happy it just ending there, you know, from someone who's worked with so many charitable organizations and, you know, a range of different, you know, academics and disciplines. I think that's a brilliant ending summary, really. So I don't want to say anything else.
I would like to just thank everyone. I mean, it's one of those sessions where I think, you know, we've sort of unboxed the black box, we've built bridges, and in doing so, I think, you know, we've thought about how anthropologists can encourage others to think differently, but it's also an opportunity to think about how others see us and how we might think differently. You know, for me, one of the big findings today was just how antisocial we can be, and the need to engage, the need to communicate, the need, as Danny raised right at the start of this session, to think about, you know, going out there and doing good, and what is the wider good. So I thoroughly enjoyed this session. We have more in the series. Helen, you mentioned earlier you hadn't been able to see any of the other ones. They are going to come online. So the RAI's YouTube page will contain a lot of these events, including today's. It does take a little while for them to be edited and uploaded, but they will be there eventually. The next in the series is on the 13th of May, between 1 and 2:30 UK time. So that's Thursday, the 13th of May. And the title is Anthropology Communicates with Government Policymakers. And I'm very pleased to say we have Cornelia Sarabji from the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. What is it? FCDO, Foreign and Commonwealth Office, combined with DFID. Brendan Donegan from Business, Energy, Enterprise. I was BEIS. I always get these
Industrial Strategy, Business.
Yeah, and easier, Government Office for Science. We have Carrie Heitmere and Alex Tasker from the Cabinet Office. So they'll all be talking about government policy making. As I say, 13th of May, 1 to 2:30. So all that remains for me is to wrap up, to thank Haneen for organising and for running the technical side so well. Also to thank our panel today who've been absolutely, it's been so great listening to you all. Thanks for your contributions, Alex, Ingrid and Danny. And I hope to see you all again in the next month. If you want to unmute your microphones, I always like to have a little round of applause at the end, and it's nice to sort of hear that as well as see it. So if you want to unmute your microphones, and we'll count down 3, 2, 1. Thank you all. And this anthropological conversation will continue next month and into the summer and then the autumn. Thank you. Bye-bye.